Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your location. We are here also from different parts of the world. My name is Ksenia Kirichenko, and I'm a program coordinator with ILGA World. Right now I'm in Geneva, and our office is also in Geneva, but I have several wonderful, amazing panelists who are working for women's rights and LGBTIQ rights, and who will be sharing with you their experiences. Let's wait for maybe 1 more minute. We have a lot of people today, 87 attendees. That's amazing. Thank you for your interest. Okay, so let's start. Thank you once again for joining. My name is Ksenia Kirichenko, and I'm a program coordinator with ILGA World. I'm doing UN Advocacy, Women and Training. And this webinar is about LGBTQ women's advocacy at the United Nations. And here I just want to know that, of course, we recognize that LGBTQI women are part of our community, and the reason why intersex women are not here is just because historically advocacy was on behalf of intersex people, were organized on behalf of intersex people compared to just women. And of course, if there are any activist folks who want to work specifically on intersex women, we are more than open supporting you, hearing you, listening you, and etc., etc. But the only reason why I is not here is just because we didn't have any concrete examples or experiences of intersex women organizing advocacy at the UN, and therefore we didn't want just to put a letter just for the sake of putting a letter, but not actually providing content. Our webinar will be for 90 minutes, and after a short introduction, which I'm going to finish very soon, we will have 6 presentations. We have Marisa Hutchinson from EWRO Asia Pacific, who will be talking about how EWRO support LGBTQI women advocacy, specifically with CEDAW. We also have Rashima Quatra from RFSL, and Rashima will be talking about CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and the Human Rights Council. Then we also have my own presentation, and I will be talking about ILGA World work to support this advocacy, and specifically on treaty bodies, CEDAW, and special procedures, some of specific special procedures. Then we have 2 brilliant attorneys from Russia, Valentina and Svetlana, who work with the Coming Out LGBTI group from St. Petersburg, Russia, and who led, I would say, groundbreaking case. It's the first case, the first positive decision from CEDAW about lesbophobic violence. And it's the first case among all the treaty bodies about hate crimes. So they will talk more about it. Then we have Aygirim Komidola from Kazakhstan, from the Kazakhstan Feminist Initiative Feminita. And Aygirim will share with you their unique experience of community-based research and advocacy, and also how they collected data. how they use it in interaction with different United Nations bodies. And then we have another brilliant speaker, Simra Shaikh from India, who will be talking specifically about trans women advocacy at the United Nations. So this is the plan. After that, we will have 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you you can see a Q&A section in your Zoom platform, and you can send your questions. You can send any questions to all the panelists or to specific panelists. Also, you can do it either anonymously, or you can use your own name, depending on your needs, circumstances. And you can send your questions at any point, but we will come to your questions at the end of all presentations. So now we have already first question. Could you confirm that all microphones are muted? All microphones are muted. Yes. Okay. So this webinar is the first webinar of ILGA World series. Because of the COVID situation, we decided to organize a series of webinars, online roundtables and advocacy webinars. We have this in this together connected series to make sure that we are with our communities in different parts of the world, that we continue to work and we continue to provide platforms for our communities during, but also after COVID. And we also want to make sure that you have access to resources, you have access to materials, to our support, and you are equipped with the needed tools to continue doing your work after after this COVID outbreak. So I think that's it for the introductory part, and so now we can start. And our first presentation is from Marisa. So Marisa, maybe you can just introduce you, because I mentioned that you are from Europe. I know that you have also another background, if you want to share it.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the brief introduction, Ksenia, and also I want to thank ILGA for having me as a presenter today. And my presentation will be on CEDAW and LBTQ advocacy. Are you sharing it?
Yeah, I'm going to do it. Yeah, it's here. Yeah, you have your presentation.
Yeah. Okay, great. So as Ksenia said, I'm a program officer with IRA Asia Pacific. So briefly, I'll give an overview of IRA. So IRA was established in 1993 for the advancement of women's human rights by using UN treaty body CEDAW as a tool of advocacy to improve the lives of women and greater social justice. And in 1997, IRA, since 1997, we have supported over 120 countries, civil society, to engage in the CEDAW process. Next slide. All right. So I've outlined some of our main priority areas for a new 5-year strategic plan. And as you can see, we work on various priority areas, inclusive of access to justice, political participation, violence against women, women and work, whether traditional or non-traditional, and also most recently on the impacts of environmental and climate crisis. We're also a key organization in networking with other partners, knowledge creation and sharing, and also policy advocacy. Next slide. Sorry. Right. So CEDAW, which I didn't say before, which is the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It was established in 1979 by the UN General Assembly, and it serves as an international advocacy tool, which helps in addressing the issues faced by women in their day-to-day lives, and is also described as an international bill of the rights of the women. CEDAW, so basically, our basic information, there are 3 CEDAW sessions annually, and those are between February and March, June and July, and October, November. And the committee which we speak of consists of 23 experts who are from various regions, academic experiences and advocacy backgrounds, and also human rights backgrounds, with their key focus being on women's rights. So why CEDAW? CEDAW, the framework, creates a space for political advocacy at all levels, whether national, regional, or global. It has a specific focus on women's rights and the rights of marginalized communities, in which NGOs play an important role in ensuring the progressive interpretation and the implementation of CEDAW standards as they relate to marginalized communities. It also, over the years, have taken on an intersectional approach to the issues affecting women and marginalized groups, and also covering broadly marginalized groups in terms of LBT women, rural women, and then intersectional issues in terms of environmental issues and women and work and others. And this creates an effective space in that it allows for political dialogue between states and the community members with CSOs present for them to get an insight on government's work on gender and women's issues, which is hard to access at the national level, as most of us know, for CSOs and also for activists. Next slide. So this is a basic diagram of the process, but it's too much to go into, which I would discuss further. But within the process, it would be nice to note that there isn't CSO participation within each step of the way. However, there's a way that we can make CSO's participation important to the process. Next slide. So ERAW, we have a program, it's known as From Global to Local, of which I was a part of in 2017, sorry. And this program aims to help women's groups and NGOs who wish to participate within the reporting process. So we basically provide information on the CEDAW process and how groups can engage with the community. We share information on the committee members, the experts on the committee, and we support the NGOs preparing for their oral statements and also for a private NGO briefing meeting. The space that we create within From Global to Local is specific for NGOs, as I've highlighted on my slide, but it is specific for NGOs because we believe that it creates a space for women's groups and activists to share solidarity and knowledge of their common goals and priorities in terms of women's human rights. So we believe that the training and mentoring gives them not just good tips for engaging with the CEDAW review, but we also aim to take an intersectional approach by aiming to center like marginalized groups and women into a political vision or into the political vision of CEDAW, and hence being a more purposive way for inclusion. And we provide space for participants basically to connect with each other's struggles, with the movements internationally, and also to just realize that there are common struggles within groups. Next slide. So, with my experience of Global to Local, as I said, I would have been present at the CEDAW review in 2017, July of 2017. And supported by ILGA, I would have arrived in Geneva, well, previously prepared and presented the shadow report. And then I arrived in Geneva where I met the ERA team, of which I was a part of then. And they would have trained us again in terms of the knowledge necessary to be effective in presenting our issues to CEDAW, to the committee, and also in that being useful for them to basically question the government or state and then also give suggestions. So for me, in terms of the experience, in terms of for global to local, the training session was very important. Also in terms of the NGO coordination meeting, which was important because even prior to CEDAW, I didn't know like you had a specific time to have your statement and that how long the statement would be, and the statement was basically for the group of countries and not only for you. So that was really important. And then the informal meeting is a good space to highlight your issues and basically claim your rights in terms of LBQT issues. But also then after that follows the NGO lunch briefing, which is also key because you get to interact with the committee specifically, and they ask questions from your presentation and also from their review of your shadow report submitted. So then you get to have one-on-one basically engagement with the various committee experts, and that in itself is effective because you get to share information which they can use and ask governments about, etc., which then leads to the constructive dialogue, which is simply an observing process for CSOs, but you are there in the room and you get to hear how governments respond with regards to their implementation of policies or lack thereof. And then following that, you have the issuing of the concluding observations of where the committee gives recommendations of what they believe or suggestions for what the government should take into account in terms of just having non-discriminatory policies in place for women. And then after that, 2 years after basically, there's a follow-up process, which I believe is important for CSOs to be a part of. A lot of times I think we might forget, which is fine, but if we are constantly on the backs basically of politicians, that we need them to do more, is necessary for us to be a part of that follow-up process. Next slide. So here I have briefly highlighted a few statements from persons who would have engaged at CEDAW with regards to LBTQ advocacy. I'm not sure if you could read it, but what I wanted to say is that within ERAW, we have, within all of our priority areas, LGBT broadly persons or organizations have always been a key part of our women's groups or marginalized groups. But a large part of our work, mainly with LBTQ advocacy, is at the CEDAW global space. And we use that space to train these activists strategically and effectively to speak to their equalities and to claim their rights. And we also like to highlight that it's not just that lobbying should be done prior or post CEDAW sessions, but it's important to do it both prior and post. And we also are very supportive in that way in terms of helping organizations lobby. Next slide, sorry. So here I have also highlighted some of the concluding observations coming from the committee between 2018 and 2019. And it shows basically a range of different areas in which the committee believed that countries could do better. And first explaining, or should I explain concluding observations? So they're described as authoritative statements or suggestions given by the committee to states after they have reviewed reports and also gathered CSO's information and reviewed it. And these recommendations basically give direction of how the state should implement or carry out further action. And then you could click Ksenia like a couple times. So then I did a mapping of the general recommendations which highlight or make provisions for LGBTQ persons. And these include just a few, about 6, which is a good start. So there's general recommendation 8, which speaks specifically to state obligation, 32, which is about refugee status, asylum, nationality, statelessness of women. There's 33, which speaks to access to justice, 35, which is gender-based violence against women, 36, which is the rights to education for both women and girls. And then most recently, GR 37, which is more with regards to disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. And we see that as, or I can say that we see it as pretty much progressive, because there was a point that there was no inclusion for LGBTQ women. Briefly,
Sorry,
so I want to highlight this, almost time?
Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to highlight briefly that we currently have a survey that we're asking persons to complete. But what I wanted to say is that at a time like this, there's always space to think about how does something like this affect a space created specifically for women. So how does the pandemic affect CEDAW? And CEDAW, that most organizations, if not all who know about it, have been a part of. But how do women raise their voices then in another space? And what we're trying to get from this survey is that how do persons see themselves otherwise functioning, or what do persons think in terms of that this session may be postponed. Like, so you wait about 4 years to have a review, and then a pandemic comes that no one can predict, and then you're unable to present your issues to the committee. So is it that we need to kind of help CEDAW to think, or with CHR, to think about another way in which we can still have our voices raised and ensure that women's voices are heard? So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Marisa. And yeah, IRO is doing really great work, and my own path in United Nations advocacy actually started from IRO training from global to local 10 years ago, when I came at that time as local defender to, at that time, New York. And therefore, I would highly recommend everyone to contact Marisa and to contact IRO if you want to work with CEDAW, with the CEDAW committee. Thank you so much, Marisa, and I'm sorry for cutting your presentation, but we have also other speakers, and
that's okay. I was done, basically.
Thank you so much. And also we have some polls for you. And actually, even though this webinar platform does not allow a lot of interactions, we have some polls for you, and Sebastian can help me with this. So we want, first, we want to run the first poll, and we want to hear from you. Do you have any experience with the United Nations mechanisms? And let's have 1 minute to see. Oh, it's like in the live mode. Please answer this poll, and it's anonymous, so we will not see who is saying what, but we just want to see what's the background of the participants. Okay, so generally we have 46% now of people who do have experience with the United Nations mechanisms, 41% who do not have this experience, and some people, they are not sure. So hopefully this webinar will give you more insight into what could be done with different United Nations bodies. Can we have the second? We have also another, the second poll. What is your knowledge of United Nations human rights mechanisms? So the first poll was about your practical experience. This is about your knowledge. Do you know anything about United Nations mechanisms? Do you know something? Are you an expert? Or maybe you are quite confident but want to know more. Let's see what do we have here. Okay, so we have more than 50% of participants knowing something about United Nations human rights mechanisms. And I'm sure after the webinar, there will be 100%. Then 28% of people are quite confident but want to know more. Hopefully we will do it. We'll provide you more information. 12% do not know anything, and 7% of people are experts. Great, and we have the last poll. Also, please participate in this. It's about specific experience with the following mechanisms, and you can choose multiple options. So, do you have any experience with CEDAW, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women? Experience with other treaty bodies, Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, other special procedures, UPR, which is Universal Periodic Review, Human Rights Council, and CSW, Commission on the Status of Women. And at this webinar, we are talking about all these mechanisms. So Marisa's presentation was about mostly CEDAW, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And there are a lot of opportunities for civil society to participate in the review of specific countries. But CEDAW and ILGA provides a lot of support and training courses to civil society. Therefore, once again, if you want to engage with CEDAW, Marisa is for sure your point to contact. Okay, so most of the people actually engaged with UPR. And we will have another webinar on UPR later. Then also a lot of people worked with the independent expert on SOGI, Victor Madrigal. Then CEDAW, also 30% of attendees worked with CEDAW, have experience with CEDAW. And also Human Rights Council is also something somewhere here, 32%. That's great. And thank you, Sebastian, for helping with the polls. So our next presentation is about Human Rights Council and the Commission on the Status of Women, and also RFSL, our friends from RFSL. So Rashima will be talking about this. We also have a presentation. Okay. Rashima, you are muted.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. I got it. I was muted by the higher ups. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone from a weirdly gray and rainy Stockholm. It is the beginning of May almost, and it still feels like winter here. Matches our current mood around the world, I think. My name is Rashima Quatra. Thanks so much for giving me some space to discuss a couple of issues here. I'm the International Advocacy Advisor at RFSL. And very briefly, RFSL is the Swedish Federation for LGBTIQ rights. We're based in Stockholm, Sweden. And amazingly and interestingly, we're one of the oldest LGBTIQ organizations around the world. We were founded in 1950. We work both locally, nationally, and internationally, and we're also a membership-based organization with over 7,000 members now and 38 chapters across Sweden. And I work on the international department along with about 12 or 13 of my colleagues. And we focus mostly on international trainings, capacity development for LGBTIQ activists, subgranting, so financing as well, and organizational development, and then advocacy at the United Nations, which is what I do, focused mainly on the Human Rights Council and CSW. And I think I can say that in the context of working with LGBTI women and gender nonconforming people, RFSL focuses on support of underrepresented groups in our programs, both in financing and in capacity building. So that's kind of built into what we do. Very quickly, we recognize that in order to create change, we need to fill gaps and ensure that we can raise visibility where visibility has not been. So we focus on supporting activists to be at the UN, to engage with decision makers, and to ensure that the representation of LGBTI lived realities are diverse and are not homogenous. We also want to ensure that relevant duty bearers and people who are making decisions on behalf of our lives on human rights are accountable for what they do and are informed and have competency on LGBTQ issues, and that we ensure that advocacy is coordinated in the work that we do. Specifically, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Council and our work within the Human Rights Council in context. I know that some of you already know about the Human Rights Council, but very briefly, since I don't have that much time, I'll also go through a couple quick, I guess, information points about what the Human Rights Council is and why I guess it's been a little bit important, why we focus there. So the Human Rights Council is the main UN organ to promote and protect human rights. It acts as a forum for dialogue on thematic issues like issues that impact sexual orientation and gender identity, and to contribute to the prevention of human rights violations. It's based in Geneva, and the Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year in March, June, and September. I guess it's important to also recognize that the Council has been extremely important to issues that impact LGBTQ people, but also that it's a contentious issue. You know, SOGIESC issues has been contentious at the UN for a long time, and progressing the rights of LGBTIQ people has been difficult, but has been progressive. It wasn't until 2011 that the first resolution was passed that acknowledged very publicly at the Council the disproportionate violence and discrimination that people face because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I think since then, a lot of progress has been made, and of course, due very much to the engagement of civil society through progressive policies and through progressive governments, and working to push for accountability for human rights violations and for the visibility of LGBTIQ issues at the UN. And I think that it's very easy for governments to deny the very existence of LGBTIQ or LGBTQ people if we're not standing in the room, if we're not there to raise our voices, to present nuance on how human rights violations are being experienced very specifically by lesbian, trans, bi queer women. And that's something that we have strived to do as an organization and work within Coalition to ensure happens. How else can the Council support your work? I mentioned before a resolution, but also the Council can come out with joint statements that are very much political, that activists can use to push for change on the ground. I know Ksenia will talk later as well about special procedures mandates, and mention the UPR, which happens about every 5 years, and countries basically get scrutinized on their human rights records. And there are many ways that NGOs and civil society can engage with those spaces to bring attention to how countries are living up to their human rights standards, what their human rights records are, and to engage very directly with permanent missions and other countries to advocate for inclusion and to put actually LGBTIQ issues on the table. Specifically from RFSL's perspective, we focus mainly on the June and the September sessions of the Human Rights Council. The June session is very much where gender issues are discussed, resolutions on on gender issues are discussed, and also where the independent expert on SOGI presents his report. So it provides with a lot of opportunities for engagement to raise the visibility of particular human rights concerns of LGBTQ women and LGBTIQ spectrum in general. We do this through delivering statements, and RFSL, of course, supports activists to draft, submit, prepare for, and present statements at the council. We support activists to meet with country delegates as well, to arrange for meetings, to coordinate advocacy before, and provide our ECOSOC accreditation so that activists can enter the space. You know, unfortunately, there's a lot of red tape with engaging with the UN system, and only a handful of organizations around the world have consultative status. RFSL is one of those, and we take that responsibility very seriously in ensuring wide access is available. Particularly, RFSL also, along with a number of other organizations and some on the webinar today, including ILGA, run Trans Advocacy Week to ensure that when we're talking about gender diversity and inclusion, and we're talking about the human rights movement and the women's rights movement, that the specific needs, issues, and priorities of trans individuals are raised and heard in the June session as well, with special rapporteurs focusing on health and other issues that are specific to trans lives and experiences. This year, the Trans Advocacy Week will be held online, and I believe this is the 4th year that Trans Advocacy Week will be held, which is really exciting. And although we can't do advocacy at the UN, perhaps this will provide for increased opportunities for engagement and participation by activists from all around the world. It's also a capacity building initiative. So I'd encourage anybody that's interested, that is trans identified, works on trans issues, to reach out and to think about watching out for information that will be shared soon about how you can engage. I will now move on to talking about the Commission on the Status of Women. So the Commission on the Status of Women is the largest forum that happens annually to talk about gender equality, women's rights issues. You know, at this point, 12,000, I believe, civil society actors come to the UN every year, and it's a space to speak with international actors, with permanent missions, with UN agencies, to dedicate some time to create the global policy framework to talk about how we can promote gender equality and women's empowerment. The main, I guess, political outcome of the Commission on the Status of Women are the agreed conclusions, which has recommendations and are very thematically based. So every year the theme changes for CSW, and community countries go in depth on how that specific theme impacts women's rights and how women are being impacted by that issue. And so LBTI inclusion has been forefront for the LBTI caucus on raising visibility within this context. It's also an extremely difficult environment to work in. The CSW is fraught with a lot of opposition. So organizations and states that have denied the rights of LGBTIQ women, that are extremely homophobic or transphobic, that have pushed back against sexual reproductive health and rights, comprehensive sexuality education. And so it's a really important space to be in, to ensure that countries don't fall back and regress on important movements that have been made and are held accountable as well to their commitments to reaching gender equality. And despite that there have been increased polarizations in this space, you know, civil society and states that want to progress the rights of all women and inclusion of LGBTIQ women have been successful in at least holding the line and ensuring that there's some language within agreed conclusions that we can use to push for rights and progress on the ground. Specifically within the context of CSW and RFSL and how we've supported activists and engagement and inclusion of LBTI issues at this space. We work within the LBTI caucus, which is a group of, I believe now 300 individuals and organizations that are working within this context to ensure that LBTI issues are visible in this space. And also within the Women's Rights Caucus, which is an even larger group that is not LBTI specific, that works on advocacy, works on outreach with states, works as advisory committees, works on coordination to ensure that we can have inclusive global conversation and policy about women's rights and inclusion. In this space, again, RFSL provides our ECOSOC accreditation to organizations and LGBTIQ activists that want to participate in this space. And we also fund activists every year to engage with the CSW, generally 2 or more LBTI individuals who can speak to the specific thematic issue and participate in side events as well as conversations and conduct advocacy with member states.
Can you hear me? Sorry, we have time. Can you wrap up this?
Yes. And the last thing I will say is I'll just talk about our Rainbow Advocacy Program, which is the second to last slide, on how RFSL specifically supports activists to engage in both of these spaces. So Rainbow Advocacy is a 13-month program, and 15 activists in the Global South and East are selected through an application process to learn about human rights and development frameworks and mechanisms. It's held in both Geneva and New York. So there's a short training, and then there's an on-the-spot learning and implementation, which is in the September session of the Human Rights Council and at the high-level political forum. Activists are also given small grants to design and implement advocacy programs. In our last cohort of 14 activists, 11 identified as LBTQ, which is another way that we've been trying very much to support the capacity building and inclusion of LBTI issues within the human rights framework. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. That's my email address, and that's RFSL's website. And sorry I ran over time. It was difficult to condense everything.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rashima. Again, sorry for interrupting, but we have time, and of course there are a lot of things to share. So now I want to share with you my own presentation and to talk about treaty bodies and special procedures. So the purpose of this webinar was to show to you different ways of engaging with United Nations human rights bodies to organize advocacy on behalf of LGBTQI women. So again, there is no I because we didn't really have a lot of practice, but if there are any intersex women who want to join this or to organize their own advocacy, of course, we are more than open for this. So I would start from treaty bodies, and in this presentation, I will tell you about 2 specific mechanisms, which are treaty bodies and special procedures. So within the United Nations human rights mechanism, one aspect, one group of mechanisms for you is treaty bodies. So treaty bodies, they're committees of independent experts. So they are usually human rights experts or experts on gender issues. And even though they coming from specific countries, they're supposed to be independent. They monitor specific treaties, and therefore it's treaty bodies. So there is a number 9 main human rights conventions at the UN, and many countries join these conventions. Every convention has its own treaty body, so a committee of independent experts who actually monitor how state parties implement these conventions. There are 10 committees, and specifically there is one committee interesting for us because it's CEDAW, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. How do they work? They have three interesting working methods. First, it's country reviews. So when country ratifies a convention, then every 4, 5, 6 years, it has to provide reports to the committee, and also NGO can provide their shadow reports. Then there is also individual complaints mechanism. So basically you can go with a specific case to CEDAW after you exhaust all the domestic courts, for example. And there are also general recommendations. Marisa also mentioned these general recommendations. It's basically authoritative interpretation of the provisions of conventions by treaty bodies. And then I would like to share with you some specific information about country reviews. So country reviews, it's one of the working methods of treaty bodies. And NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society can participate in different process here. First of all, they can provide shadow reports. So you can write a short report about the situation of LGBTQI women in your country. And it can be, for example, up to 10 pages. You can include there any statistics, any information, any cases, official or maybe information collected by your organization, and then to send it to CEDAW or any other treaty bodies. Then you can also come to Geneva to participate actually in the session. And Marisa also told you more about processes within CEDAW. And then also an important thing is follow-up and monitoring. So when you get good recommendations, it's of course also important to see what actually the state is doing with these recommendations. CEDAW specifically covered a broad range of topics relevant for our communities, which include criminalization of same-sex relations between women, also criminalization of a specific form of gender expression or gender identity, discrimination in different spheres, stereotypes against LGBTQI women, marriage and partnerships, which is quite progressive because CEDAW is more or less open to raise these issues compared to other committees. Then also artificial reproductive technologies and parental rights, legal gender recognition, and also intersex medical procedures, even though it was more about intersex persons and not intersex women specifically. And this chart, which I wanted to share with you, so in 2018, ILGA had a specific focus on LGBTQI women and their engagement with CEDAW. So we specifically supported these activists coming to CEDAW, and we also connected them with, you cannot see my slides, really. Okay, now yes? Yes, okay. So we will share with you all the presentations, so you will see everything. So these were my slides, and this is the chart. So you can see this chart, and as I mentioned, in 2018 we specifically supported LGBTQI women in their engagement with CEDAW, you can see that also this was specifically a year when we received the highest number of LBTI references and recommendations by CEDAW. So I wanted to show you this to prove that actually your participation in treaty bodies review, specifically shadow reports, coming to Geneva, engaging with committee members, committee's experts, it matters. And you can see that when we had people participating here, the number of recommendations was much higher. Therefore, I would encourage you, of course, to work with these mechanisms. Then also, I can share with you some examples of recommendations received by groups we supported. So, for example, this is Chile, and there were trainings for judiciary and other state authorities. There was recommendation to Nepal, related to healthcare providers and discrimination in healthcare. And there were, of course, much more examples. Another mechanism of engaging with treaty bodies is individual complaints. So basically, treaty bodies, committees, specifically CEDAW, they can act as kind of supranational courts. And after you went through all the stages on the national level, and if you did not receive positive decision, you can go to CEDAW or any other treaty bodies. So here you can see different topics, and I mentioned that we will share with you all these presentations after the webinar, so you will also get this information. But I just wanted to tell you about topics covered within jurisprudence of treaty bodies, and to give you some examples of concrete cases reviewed by treaty bodies, specifically on LBTQ women. There were no cases on intersex persons or intersex women specifically so far, but there were some cases on LBT women. So criminalization of same-sex relationships. There were no decisions, but there is a pending case submitted against Sri Lanka, and in 2 weeks or so, next month, we will have a specific webinar about strategic litigation before treaty bodies, and we will have actually a person who submitted this case who will share with you information about their campaign and their litigation. So then there are also a group of cases related to hate crimes and hate speech, and specifically a recent case ON and DP versus Russia, and we have two brilliant attorneys who will tell you more about it a bit later. Then there are cases also about asylum seekers, when, for example, lesbian couples or women went to global north countries to ask for asylum, and when they were refused within the country. So, for example, there was a case MI versus Sweden, where there was a decision to deport a lesbian woman back to Bangladesh by Swedish authorities, and the Human Rights Committee considered this situation and decided that that would violate the rights of MI, and she should not be sent back to Bangladesh because of the situation she faced in the country of origin. Then there are also cases related to freedom of assembly and association and freedom of expression. And one case was about sanctions, administrative sanctions for propagating homosexuality in Russia. And it was brought by activists. Then also there was a case related to family, where the Human Rights Committee found a violation. So there was a lesbian couple, C versus Australia. There was a lesbian couple who were married outside of Australia, and then they went back to Australia, and they didn't have access to divorce. So the committee decided that that was a violation. And also there was a case about legal gender recognition, and it was brought by a trans woman, G, also against Australia. And the problem was that Australian legislation at that point required divorce for change of documentation, and the committee decided that that was a violation. Then the second part of the mechanisms I want to talk to you about is special procedures. So special procedures, it's another mechanism within the United Nations human rights system. They could be called working groups or special rapporteurs or independent experts, but generally it's more or less the same. So they are also independent experts, but they are responsible either for specific topics. We have 44 thematic mandates, or for specific countries. We have also 12 country mandates, for example, on Belarus or on Iran. And among 44 thematic mandates, 3 are specifically interesting for LGBTQI women, which is the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and the Independent Expert on SOGI. Special procedures, these mechanisms, they implement also 3 main working methods, which are country visits, communications, and country reports. So country visits, each mandate within special procedures, they conduct 1, 2, or 3, usually country visits. They come to specific countries to research the situation within their mandate. So, for example, the working group on discrimination against women could go to, let's say, South Africa to see what is the situation with discrimination against women. And then they also prepare recommendations to the state, and they also compile a report. Then there is also communications. So you can also bring specific cases or draft legislation, problematic legislation, to these special procedures, and they will communicate this to your state. And there are also thematic reports. So it's not country reports, it's thematic reports. So they also issued and present thematic reports within their mandates. And then I just want to give you a bit more examples. And so the first working methods of special procedures I mentioned was country visits. And the three most important for our agenda mandates, they conducted a number of visits to different countries. And here you can see the list of countries. These are all the countries where LGBTQI agenda was raised by special procedures. So if you are from any of these countries, you can contact us and see what actually was said about the situation of LGBTQI women in your country. So for example, this is a country report of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in South Africa, and they made a specific recommendation on hate crime legislation. Another example is a working group on discrimination against women who came to Poland, and there was a recommendation to ensure access to healthcare services, including reproductive health care and tailored care to address specifically the needs of LGBTI women. Then there was also a country visit of the independent expert on SOGI to Mozambique, and he mentioned corrective rapes specifically. This is an example of independent expert on SOGI country visits to Argentina, when he specifically mentioned employment and work conditions for trans women. Another working method of special procedures is communications. These communications, they are different from treaty bodies, because here your country does not need to ratify any convention. You don't have to exhaust domestic remedies. So literally after the violation took place, you can next day you can write to special procedures, and there is this online form. So on this slide you can see this online form, and it's quite simple. So you can send your communications in cases of actual violations, or in case of risks of violations, or if there is any draft legislation which could be discriminatory towards your community. And here are some examples of situations when special procedures actually made communication. So you can see also different types of communications here. And then I also mentioned that special procedures, they do thematic reports, and there were a lot of thematic reports by different mandates when they specifically mentioned LGBTQI women. Or lesbian, bisexual women, it depends on the report. And also as civil society, you can provide inputs for this report to make sure that LGBTQI women's voices are heard, and to make sure that your community is also visible. And specifically, I would like to mention here two upcoming thematic reports by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. So she's going to collect information and to create reports about two topics relevant for us. One is about rape as a human rights violation against women. And of course, here we can talk about corrective rapes. We can talk about sexual violence within same-gender couples, for example. We can talk about non-recognition of sexual crimes against trans women, etc., etc. And the other submission is about COVID-19 and gender-based violence during the COVID outbreak. So she's also collecting information about how COVID-19 situation affected women, and women generally, like it's a broad term. here we can also think about, of course, domestic violence. We can think about violence or abuse related to gender-related regimes of attending any places like supermarkets, for example, in Latin America, in some countries in Latin America. And if you have any information on these topics, then please share this with us, and we would be more than happy to prepare this submission together and together to make our communities visible. This is just an example of one report. So it's the thematic report of the independent expert on SOGI. It's his recent report on socio-economic inclusion, and he specifically mentioned lesbian, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse women and persons in his report. And if you want to know more, again, contact us, and we would be happy to share with you more links. That's it from my side. So presentations will be available later, and okay. Now we have also Svetlana and Valentina, who will be talking about strategic litigation and specific cases. And just another technical note, in the chat you can also see different web links to different guides and resources on advocacy, which could be useful for you. So the floor is yours, Svetlana and Valentina.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Just a second. Sorry. All right, hello everyone. My name is Valentina. I'm a lawyer from Russia. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak about this case, because I also agree with Ksenia completely that this is a very interesting, important, and historic judgment on women's rights. And I will first describe how we decided to go to CEDAW. And actually we decided to go to CEDAW together with Ksenia, who also lives in St. Petersburg back then in 2013. And then I will pass the floor to my colleague Svetlana, who represented our clients before CEDAW committee. So I also represent victims of gender-based violence, like general gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, before CEDAW committee. And CEDAW has rather advanced jurisprudence on those issues. And I would like to start saying that this jurisprudence and these recommendations are perfectly relevant to cases of gender-based violence against lesbian women as well. So as you will see probably in this case later, CEDAW did not mention these general recommendations on violence against women, right? These requirements of effective investigation or impartiality, but rather CEDAW just added some new recommendations specific to the issues of discrimination against lesbian women. So we decided to go to CEDAW because, first of all, we wanted to address very specific issues of multiple forms of discrimination and gender stereotyping, and how those affect women's access to justice. And so the primary purpose, of course, was to defend our clients' rights, but also we had this very general public interest to advance CEDAW jurisprudence, to develop it in terms of LGBT rights as well. So speaking about the case itself, it was an attack on two lesbian women in St. Petersburg. So two men followed them from a subway station. Then one of them physically attacked them on the street, and another one, he filmed this attack with his mobile phone. And then those two girls reported the event, the crime, to the police the day after, and they also provided all possible evidence that they could collect back then. So they provided detailed statement, medical evidence. They also asked the police to collect video footage and so on and so forth. And they also reported that those two men used some homophobic expressions. So they mentioned that it was actually a hate crime. But unfortunately, the investigation was initiated only 7 months after the event, and before that, we had to go to the court claiming that the police did nothing to investigate, to examine the circumstances and everything. And so when the case was initiated, they classified this crime as a general battery, so just general physical violence without any reference to any motive of hatred against lesbian women. And so we applied to reclassification of this offense, saying that you have to recognize that it is a hate crime in order to conduct an effective investigation. And there is a very clear standard in ECHR, for instance, jurisprudence, that if national legislation allows you to consider this motive of hatred, you have to do this, because otherwise the whole investigation will be ineffective. But unfortunately, the police said that until they have a person, an actual person, a suspect, they cannot say anything about the motive. So therefore, they just left it as a general battery. And unfortunately, in 2016, the criminal offense of battery was decriminalized. Some of you probably heard of this as the decriminalization of domestic violence, because domestic violence also classified under this offense. Yeah, I will next pass the floor to my colleague Svetlana, who will tell you more about the content of our communication to CEDAW. And she will also speak about the findings of the committee and the recommendation that the committee gave to the Russian authorities.
Hello to everyone. My name is Svetlana, and I will talk about the proceedings before the committee in this case, and the outcome of these proceedings about the committee's decision. So we launched a communication in March 2017, and it was registered by the committee and transmitted to the respondent states in July of the same year. And Russia submitted their comments quite significantly, with a significant delay, only in May 2018, and the committee delivered its decision in February this year. So the whole proceedings took 3 years in this case. And now I turn to the findings of the committee. Actually, the decision is important, since for the first time CEDAW addressed the issue of discrimination of lesbian women in the context of homophobic violence. First of all, the committee reminded its case law with regard to multiple forms of discrimination, saying that some groups of women are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence, and that those victims of crimes belonging to these vulnerable groups often face difficulties of accessing to justice due to prejudiced negative stereotypes against them on the part of the authorities. And for the first time, the committee recognized that lesbian women are vulnerable to homophobic gender-based violence. And more specifically in this case, the committee held that the investigative authorities did not take into account the motive of hatred, and they initiated the criminal proceedings in this case only 7 months after the events, and it was too late. Actually, the most crucial time was lost for collecting evidence, and it wasn't possible actually anymore to investigate the crime effectively. And then the committee also concluded that the actions of the authorities were influenced by negative stereotypes against lesbian women, and due to this fact, they failed to investigate the crime effectively and timely. And the committee also noted that by this failure to investigate the crime effectively, the authorities subjected the authors to anguish and fear. And the committee decided that Russia violated the author's rights under Articles 1, 2, and 5 of the Convention. And the committee also made recommendations, a number of recommendations to the Russian authorities with regard to redress. And concerning individual redress, the committee said that the Russian authorities should provide the authors with monetary compensation and psychological rehabilitation. And with regard to general measures, the committee indicated a number of specific measures. First of all, it said that Russia should provide special training for police and other law enforcement authorities in order that they treat actually homophobic crimes against lesbians either like as hate crimes or as gender-based violence. And then the committee said that the Russian Federation should comply with its general obligations to protect, to fulfill, and to respect human rights of lesbian women. And then the committee also indicated that the investigative authorities should always take into account the specific motive of hatred in case of homophobic violence against lesbians. And what is very important is said that in all such cases, the authorities should open a criminal case. And then the committee also indicated that the state should provide to lesbian women who were victims of such violence, such homophobic violence, with effective access to justice, including free legal assistance that is needed. And it is also a very important recommendation, since in Russia there is no free legal assistance at all for victims of crimes. And now the Russian authorities should reply to these recommendations within 6 months, and to provide information how they intend to implement or how they are implementing those recommendations. And of course, St. Petersburg LGBT group coming out will participate in this follow-up process. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Svetlana and Valentina. And so, as I mentioned, it was the first case about lesbophobic violence, the first case within treaty bodies, and therefore it can be a precedent in the basis for new complaints and new cases from all your countries, of course, if your country ratified the optional protocol for CEDAW. So now we also have another person, another speaker, another activist from Kazakhstan, Aygerim.
Yeah.
Great.
Hello. Yeah, I'm gonna share my slides. Okay, yeah, great. Well, thank you for the warm introduction. My name is Aygerim, and I oversee legal advocacy work of Kazakhstan Feminist Initiative Feminita. This is a grassroots queer feminist initiative which works on monitoring, documenting, and advocacy of the rights of LGBTQ women in Kazakhstan. And I'm going to talk about the use of UN treaty bodies and special procedures by grassroots groups like ours. So when we talk about the grassroots activities we do, which feed into our advocacy work, we could roughly group them into 3 activities. It's research, its monitoring, documenting, and reporting, and its litigation of certain cases. So I'm gonna stop on each of them briefly. The first research our initiative did was needs assessment of LBQ women in Kazakhstan in 2016 and 17, and it covered 16 regions. It was unique in a way that it applied an intersectional approach, and it was the first research which actually focused on specifically LBQ women, and also it was conducted and analyzed by LBQ women living in Kazakhstan or the region. So what it showed a portrait of LBQ women communities in different parts of Kazakhstan, which is a huge country. It identified political and socioeconomic needs of LBQ women, whether it's physical and mental well-being, it's education, healthcare, informational and legal support. And it also highlighted the cases of discrimination and human rights violation of women on the basis of sexual orientation. The next research we did actually sprang out from the previous research, and that was on the rights to health of LGBTI women and transgender men in Kazakhstan. And it covered 19 regions in the country, and also applied intersectional approach, and interestingly was conducted in cooperation with co-researchers from LGBTQ communities, which we recruited and trained in our school. What research showed, it showed the health needs of the specific groups excluded from mainstream research, enhanced funding, state and non-state health programs, and it also identified heightened risks of STI, HIV, sexual and reproductive, mental health issues, and also SOGI-related oncological risks. We also been doing quite a lot of monitoring and documenting. And when we talk about monitoring and documenting, we do it by analyzing secondary sources like media, reports and researches conducted by other groups. For example, this year we are doing analysis of hate speech on basis of SOGI in media in Kazakhstan, but also the direct communication we receive by different channels. So the bright example of that would be the case of Almagul, which was the case of a queer woman who faced employment discrimination. And the third activity we do is litigation. And here I can highlight that we've been litigating cases of lesbian women or LGBTQ activists' right to privacy, freedom of expression, assembly, and association. So the first case here is Sentai women's case, and it's a case on regarding two lesbian women who were filmed kissing without their consent, and consequently the perpetrator shared the video on the social media with incitement to hate, and the video became viral and outed the women. Another case is on actually our initiative case on its denied registration, as the initiative has been trying to register on several occasions and been systemically denied. And in its recent court decision, its claim was dismissed on the grounds that it doesn't provide for strengthening of well-being, well-established spiritual and moral values, prestige, and role of the family in society. And similarly, on the freedom of expression and work of women human rights defenders, the next case is on the queer feminist activist who was arbitrarily detained for participation in a public photo shoot on destigmatization on menstruation and faced both charges of petty hooliganism. So, so we've been litigating these cases at the national level, and I'm going to return to this in the second part of my presentation. So when we talk about the engagement with treaty bodies and special procedures, we try to incorporate our activities, which I talked about. So, so with treaty bodies, we basically have done the shadow reporting, and I have to say that we do it in cooperation with the Transgender Initiative of Almaty since the very start. So the first shadow report kicked off in 2016, and we incorporated the findings of our research from the needs assessment. And we didn't participate in the procession, so maybe we didn't, that's why we didn't get the list of issues, questions and list of wishes, but we received the first concluding observations by the committee, and namely on listing the SOGI in the state's anti-discrimination legal framework, and the second one on review of legal gender recognition procedure for a transgender person in Kazakhstan. They didn't score in follow-up procedure, but at the national level, what we had, in a coalition of civil society organization, we drafted respective 2 roadmaps on implementation of the 2 recommendations and presented them to the state authorities chaired by the Minister of Justice in 2018. And since then, we are constantly working on that. The second report we did in the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And here we also incorporated the findings from the research on the needs assessment, and also included the registration case as a pressing issue. So we got 3 questions at the procession and the aftermath of the procession, and and we received 3 concluding observations, which were specifically on SOGI, and some of them were reinforcing the previous recommendation by the Human Rights Committee. So there was the recommendation on adoption of the anti-discrimination legislation, and also, as we included the case on registration, there was a recommendation on enabling, creating an enabling environment and functioning registration procedure for civil society organizations working on promotion and protection of LGBT rights. So yeah, and what we did in the aftermath, so we continued with our first roadmap, and we also included this recommendation on registration in our submission to the Supreme Court in the registration case. And the most recent shadow report we did to CEDAW at the end of last year, we included the findings from the first research. We also included the preliminary findings from the research on right to health, and also included the new cases on the case of Janar, on the case of Women's March, and also in the case of Almagul. So, and as a result, we got quite an avalanche of SOGI specific recommendations. So,
I'm sorry, I'm afraid we are running out of time. If you can wrap up.
Yeah. Okay. So we did. So So as a result, we received recommendations specifically reinforcing the previous one, but also we received recommendations on, let's say, inclusion of trans women's needs in the state healthcare policies, and also repealing the list of banned jobs for women. And at the national level, what we tried to include this recommendations in our submissions to cases to the Supreme Court or at follow-up procedures. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raymond. Yeah, Feminita, I think it's a perfect example of how local activists organized community-based advocacy and how they used United Nations human rights mechanisms to actually change the situation on the ground. And I think that we are running out of time, but still I would really ask you to, if you can, just stay with us for a bit more time, maybe 15 minutes, because we have a really brilliant speaker, Simran Shaikh from India, who can talk and share her experience of advocating for specifically trans women in trans women's rights. And I'm personally really looking forward to hear this presentation, and then we will have some time also for a Q&A session. So Simran, please introduce yourself also, and I will help you with your presentation.
Sure. Thank you so much. Namaskar, everyone. My name is Simran, and my preferred pronunciations are she and hers. And I'm currently wearing multiple hats, but today at this forum, I represent as the co-founder of RWS, which is an organization which works for LGBTQI in India. It's just not the alone one. There are thousands of ones, but among the thousand, this is also the one which I work with. Can we have the next slide, please? So if you might have seen my presentation, it starts with act to change. It is really, really very important that we start addressing the need that we need to change the act. And act just does not comes in the books, it also comes with here. So it is very relevant that we will change the mindset. I would like to start with a small background. And you might see in my presentation that I have presented the word called India, because I belong from India. That's not the reason only that I have presented the word India, but it also denotes that India is sort of a mini continent in this huge, beautiful globe. And that is why I wanted to share this. And all my evidences are with references which you can really relate to. I really wanted to
I think we have some technical problems. Simran, we cannot hear you. Maybe you can. Okay, so maybe while we are waiting for Simran, maybe we can answer some of the questions which we had. Rashima, I know that there were some questions to you. Maybe you want to answer some of them. Do you want? So there was a question about how to join LBTI and Women's Rights Caucasus listserv.
Yep, got it. I can't unmute myself, so I just have to wait to be unmuted. Yeah. I tried to answer a couple of questions along the way that I saw or that were flagged in the Q&A question open answer chat box. But very quickly, how to join the Women's Rights Caucus listserv or the LBTI Caucus listserv. Both listservs require some vetting. So if you would like to join the LBTI Caucus listserv, you can certainly email me. And what we do is we just ask the community that's already involved if they can vouch for your inclusion. And this is, of course, to protect against opposition and others to be included in the list, and just security that we protect and try and provide at least a little bit for the work that we do, and for others on the list as well. The Women's Rights Caucus listserv is not managed by anybody on the LBTI caucus, and there's a very specific form that you have to fill out that is sent out every year with each new CSW session, where you agree to a certain number of values and of principles, and then those who are in charge of the Women's Rights Caucus vet that and have that inclusion. But within the LBTI caucus, oh my God, listserv, we always share this as well. I don't think I can say LBTI caucus for any longer. And then another question was about which platforms have we had the most success in advocating for LGBTQ rights? Where should advocacy be focused, and how to deal with opposition? I think that's an extremely difficult question, and is extremely contextual. So depending on what results you want to see, I guess, will dictate which mechanism is best. So of course, activists have used the UPR mechanism and gotten comments that they could take back to their countries and ask for policy change, legal change, and that has been very much domesticated and been extremely helpful. Special procedures mandate holders have been able to comment on legislation that is being drafted or being considered, and have been able to change them to be more inclusive of LGBTIQ people or the needs of, let's say, specifically like trans minors in or trans issues in Ireland. Depending on the how political the issue is, or what response you're trying to get from your country, I think that will really dictate which human rights mechanism is best for the type of work that you're doing. And so there's not a one size fits all answer, unfortunately, but I think diversifying your diversifying where you get involved is important. Secondly, opposition.
Sorry, Rashima,
oh, okay.
Yeah, we've got, I think Simran is again back. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Extremely sorry. I don't know what happened all of a sudden.
Okay, so we have your presentation, Simran.
Yes,
please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm extremely sorry once again. So I was just speaking on the terms of, let's understand the universe of transgender people around the world as well as India. When we talk about India specifically, the reason I mentioned, because it's one of the mini continent, and in the year of 2011, of course, it's a very old data, but the census of India really presented then that 1.1% of the total population of India is actually categorized as others, which means either trans people. And very surprisingly, if you note that around 55,000 children at the age of 0 to 6 really ticked themselves as transgender kids, as others, because we have an option called others in India, and that's why people really selected that word. So prominently, we have evidence which clearly states that we have a huge population. And when we talk about the Asia Pacific region, we have a census which says around 9 to 9.5 million lives in Asia and Pacific region alone. Can we have the next slide, please? The word, it's very important that we really start the transgender by actually knowing the umbrella term. Of course, in Indian context, and Indian friends who are there right now on this list as an attendees would agree with me that in India, we have a huge terminology when we talk about transgender. We consider transgender as an umbrella term. And somebody did really ask me that, is there any segregation between the intersex and trans people or transgender umbrella? So the answer is yes, we have a segregation now. Initially, when we were trying to term the coin of transgender, we had everything together in one single umbrella, which you can see it in my next slide. But in this slide, I really wanted to mention that we have a gender-specific trans umbrella term in India when we talk about transgenders. Can we have the next? So this is here where I'm coming from. Now talking about the issues of why it is important to have trans objectives during the United Nations assemblies or during the United Nations debates, to have either segregated or sort of a separate kind of an identity. But let us first really understand the issues that one as identified as a transgender needs to face. And I couldn't list down the entire spectrum of issues, but the main highlights and which have anecdotals or which have evidences, that is what been presented out here in the presentation. I'm showing you the my first picture shows you the slide of 8 country studies which was done by UNDP ICMRW to know the violence among the transgender, and you can see the spectrum of the entire that a trans identified individually has to face. And I'm sure it is much beyond this country, but unfortunately I couldn't find that data, but I could present at least this 8 country data in front of you. The second picture, of course, is about the perpetrator when they have violence against transgenders, and this is specifically towards the Indian study that we had. And it is so obvious that the emotional factor of violence is so high within the transgender community that a person has to go emotionally violent, you know, just because they are identified, quote unquote, as trans identities. Next slide, please. I also want to take you to a journey from a childhood to an adolescent to an adulthood. It is really very surprising to see that a trans identified person, you know, from the childhood to the adulthood has to face so many problems from the society just because they are a bit different, or they categorize themselves a bit different, and which leads to so many factors of issues which just not limits only to health, but also towards their mental health, towards the variety of spectrum which can be noted over here. Especially if you see the impacts of, you know, a childhood perspective of a transgender is definitely towards the low self-esteem, the lack of social support and the confidence that one has to go. When they come towards their adolescence, they are forced into sexual initiation. It could be for XYZ reasons, pressure to marry, leave their homes, drop out from schools, but that leads to only forced sexual initiations. And when we talk about their adulthood, of course, we all know that transactional sex, risky behaviors, getting adapted to substance abuse and depressions are the real factor cause. It's also one factor that you know, increases the tremendous prone towards violence. Can we go to the next? This slide is really very sort of informative, because if we notify from 2008 till 2014, we would really see the hate crime has multiplied n number of folds. While we talk about the killings, the murders, just because they are invisibly visible, and because people consider them, you know, as aliens, because it is not something fitting in the binary terms, and that's why I have used the word called invisibly visible, and that's why the hate crimes really occur. There have been multiple studies from all across the globes. You can name few of them are from Transgender Europe, which has done murder monitoring. ILGA Asia has done a beautiful study. APTN has done a beautiful study. Localized individual trans people across the globes in Africa, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka have done beautiful studies which really evidently proves this. However, while it proves this, the hate crime does exist, there is a lack of evidence which is to be published globally when we talk about trans murders or trans hate crimes. And it is not because people are not publishing, it is because of the X factors such as our law enforcement agencies who do not have that education to understand that what it means to be a trans identified person. Example, it is very difficult for a law enforcement individuals to really understand whether a trans woman is actually a woman or it is, or maybe a male or a female, because they only denote what is the sex being assigned during the birth and not considering the gender while it has been stated. Can we go to the next slide? Apart from violence, the hate crimes, there are also number of factors which are making trans people vulnerable. Let us talk about employment. Let us talk about opportunities. Anecdotals and surveys do reveal that 14% transgender sex workers are more vulnerable as compared to cisgender sex workers. Due to no employment, due to no opportunities, majority of the trans women engage themselves in sex work because they only consider sex work as a source of income at that point of time. I do not here purposefully say that sex work is bad or sex work is illegal. I support sex work because sex work itself is a word, and I appreciate that work. Surveys of most of the transgenders, women especially, say that between the age of 16 to 40 are the ones who are more active into the sex work industry because that gives them the money. But having said that, the money, it also brings humiliation, beating, harassments, blackmail from the law enforcement agencies when they are caught during sex work. And that becomes a subject of more dependency or more vulnerable towards hate crime, towards the n number of issues of transgender identified individuals. Next slide, please.
Simran, I'm sorry, maybe we can have 2-3 more minutes.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide then?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to flag on the experience that last year I was fortunate enough by RSFL, ILGA World, to be participating during the Trans Advocacy Week. It was my first time, but I picked up 4 things, and those experiences are very, very important for me. The first thing that I learned during the United Nations HRC independent expert, when Victor was giving out his speech and findings and his fact findings, what he was giving out, it triggered to my mind 2 things. One is, how can I take this report and take it to the grassroots level, where it is really important for us to really strengthen the indicators that have been already developed at the apex body, and how then we can bring it down over here. there were beautiful reports, there were beautiful interventions being presented by so many trans activists during the independent expert who was there. And it talked about various issues for the first time, according to me. That was education, employment, housing, and health. I have been always hearing about health, and especially towards HIV. But for the first time, I was hearing actually about education, employment, housing, and the other factors. Can we go to the next?
Oh, sorry. It's a report. Yeah.
So two things according to my purview for this presentation is trans community should never be separated, according to me, when it comes to the development work. Oops, I think the presentation has disappeared.
It's here.
Yeah, sorry. So two things according to me, that it shouldn't be separated from the development work. But of course, when we talk about there could be a few exceptionals when we talk about specific health issues of trans women, and for example, drafting strategies of fighting discrimination and stigma, those could be excluded. But according to me, the aspects of development work should be congregated and should not be separated. The one thing that prominently I have learned from me being at the UNAIDS ECB member at the Asia Pacific, it gave me one trigger that, you know, HIV movement had led to recognition on and inclusion of various communities at large. And HIV movement has really helped so many countries to understand many issues of community throughout the globe. I think we don't sort of fall only on HIV right now to understand the trans perspective. It is also important that our experience, our case studies, and our anecdotals become evident for people to really understand that what it means to be a transgender. Because, can I have the last slide? Because transgender's life does matter.
Thank you so much, Simran. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you for sharing your experience. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry for running out of time, because I know that there are a lot of amazing things for each of us to share with you. And we try to answer all the questions. There are maybe a few questions we didn't answer, and yeah, there are a lot of questions which were asked, and we tried to do it. Sebastian, do you think?
Yes, yes. There's one question that it's why is it that the word preferred is placed in front of gender under the trans terminology, and how is this narrative playing out in India? I believe that Simran can answer this question, or it was directed for her.
It's for Simran. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, so just directly answering this question in a very short time, that is, the word which I wrote preferred in front of the gender terminology is because there is a spectrum of umbrella term in India where people are either comfortable calling themselves as trans women, trans identified women, or maybe a subsect which is so very prominent in India and the neighboring countries like Pakistan and Nepal, which is as hijras. So that is the reason why we wrote the word called preferred in front of the gender, because it gives you a preference to select the terminology from the umbrella term. And how it is playing in India, it is playing very well, because both the spectrums have a very good prominence at their own spaces.
The following question, I believe, is also addressed to Simran, and it is, what does it look like in places where HIV programs or fundings are not available, and where is the entry point for inclusion of the transgender communities?
Oh, that is a little sort of a difficult, not a difficult question, but yes. See, every coin has two sides of it. One side, when we talk about, there are very limited funds, especially while we are talking about HIV programs. And the second is the capacity of transgender community for applying for those funds. So it is both the dimensions. I do not disagree that there are limited funding opportunities, or there is less of trans community. Both the spectrums are there, but sometimes either of the one misses the bus, and that's how there is a very limited resources right now available for trans communities, especially when we talk about from the Indian perspectives.
Thank
you, Simran. Sebastian, do we have any other open questions?
I believe all questions have been addressed. There's the first comment by Anna Judith. So if maybe you could address it. It's, dear all, thank you for this interesting webinar. I would like to encourage you all to consider also advocating for LGBTQ women and other LGBTQ persons' rights at the upcoming postponed UN Crime Congress. I'm sorry, it disappeared briefly.
Yeah, I think it's a very big question, of course, and UN Crime Congress and also other mechanisms such as draft new convention. And yeah, I think we can also organize the whole webinar about this aspect and about LGBTQI issues in the context of humanitarian law, not just human rights law, but also humanitarian law, how it plays within different conflicts and conventions. Yeah, maybe we will do it in the future, but generally, yeah, it's a very interesting point, of course.
The latest question, I believe also Simran can address it. What similarities are there, if there are any, among trans persons in the developed and developing countries?
There are, oh, where did the question go?
Answer it.
I can't see the question.
What similarities, if any?
Oh,
Yeah.
got it.
Are there among trans persons in the developed and developing countries?
So there are many similarities. I mean, when we sort of when we talk about sorry, there are not so many similarities when we talk about the developing and the developed countries. There are, especially when we talk about the human rights angle as compared between the developed and the developing countries. It's two different things, because the developing countries are always are part of learning processes. The struggles are more. And when we talk about the trans persons, majority of the developing countries lack the so-called activists or the leaders, according to my lens, and I could be completely wrong for this, but according to my lens, I really feel that, you know, there needs to be investment done on the developing countries of as trans persons are considered, and there are not so many similarities when we see, but one similarity is there, that is trans is a trans is a trans.
Thank you, Simran. So any other questions? I think we don't have any other questions. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for participating here. Thank you every of the speakers. It was really great to have you here and to also to share these diverse realities and these diverse experiences. And for the participants of the webinar, we will share with you the presentations, and also we will share with you the video from the webinar. So any personal details related to attendees, of course, they will not be shared in this video, but you will be able to see all the presentations and everything we were talking about in the video. And if we have any Spanish speakers, we also will produce Spanish version with the subtitles, with Spanish subtitles. And in the future, we will have more webinars on UN advocacy. Specifically, we will try to engage and to invite intersex people, intersex women for new webinars. Otherwise, let's keep in touch and take care of yourself and people around you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.